Thank you for joining us tonight. So Varda Haimo, owner of Bread Obsession in Lexington, will discuss how she became obsessed with recreating the rye breads and bagels of her childhood, and in the process transformed herself from a financial services professional into a baker and bakery owner. She will discuss the evolution of her business from a one-woman show run out of her home kitchen to a productive and fast-growing partnership and local employer. At the end of the presentation, we'll have some bread for you to sample if you would like. My name is Helen Liu, and I'm the Programming and Partnerships Manager at Carey Library. Before we begin, I want to take a moment to thank the Carey Library Foundation. Their support enables us to bring programs like tonight's event to you. We will have a Q&A at the end of the program. At that time, if you raise your hand, I'll bring over a microphone. We are recording this program and it will be posted to the library's YouTube channel. Now I'd like to introduce our speaker. Varda Haimo studied mathematics in college and graduate school, receiving a PhD in applied mathematics from Harvard University. She had a long career in project management, first in communications networking at BBN in Cambridge, and then transitioned to managing financial analysis systems at fund management companies, including Fidelity, TIAA, and Putnam Investments. In 2013, after a 5-year self-taught bread baking apprenticeship, she opened Bread Obsession, an artisan bread company, which moved to Lexington in 2022. Welcome, Varda.
So, Varda Haimo, I own Bread Obsession, which is a local bakery in Lexington. And I wanted to tell the story of how that came to be, because it really wasn't my path. I was on a completely different path. And somehow I got distracted and off I went in this other direction. So just wanted to tell you that story. I'm telling a story, so you have to start somewhere. So I'm going to start in 1969. Actually, that's when this picture was taken. There was, in St. Louis, Missouri, there was a very beloved and well-established bakery called Pratzel's. And Pratzel's was founded by Polish immigrants in 1912. And as it happened, it survived exactly 100 years. And then the family, it had gone through 3 generations of the family, and then the 4th generation had no interest in it. And so it closed down, and there was a lot of wailing and renting of garments in St. Louis because people just loved that place so much. So I was a kid. I didn't do the shopping, but my dad did the shopping. And he would come home with loaves of sitzel, which was as I found out later, I didn't know at the time, I thought it was just like the greatest bread ever, but it's a light deli rye. And it had cornmeal on the outside, and that he would come home with these round loaves of it, and if I saw it on the counter, I was on it, and I ate a lot of that sitzel, and it was very good. And later, when I was learning about bread and so forth, and I was posting in different places and so forth, all these people from my school, whom I didn't even know had loved this bread, came out and said, "Oh, we remember that bread. We ate that bread too." So it was widely loved, even though I had no idea anybody else that I knew was eating it. So, one more piece of St. Louis bread history. When I was, I don't know, around 10 or something, a New York bagelry opened on the main drag near my house. And when it opened, it was like the event of the century. And there were people lined up around the block, and they were buying dozens and dozens of bagels. And the story that we heard at the time was that a New York bagel maker had flown into St. Louis and told the cab driver, take me to the Jewish section of town. So he took him to the Jewish section of town, and he immediately on the spot rented a place and opened a bagelry, and that's why there were thousands of people like waiting around to get their bagels. So I looked it up just now, just putting together this talk, and this is a completely different story. So the story that we were told was maybe, I don't know, maybe perhaps fabricated. Apparently, a group of St. Louis businessmen sent one of their own off to New York City to learn how to make bagels. And he learned how to make bagels, and he came back and he started this place. And it was fantastically successful. And this, the 5 ingredients, what a surprise. That's how you make bagels. That's how we make bagels. So it's basically 5 ingredients plus whatever, toppings and so forth. And that's what we were eating. My father used to go to the bagelry. He'd get dozens of bagels. He'd go to the deli and he would bring back whatever, corned beef or lox or whatever. And we would have these big feasts on our dining room table. And it was a lot of fun. So, at the same time that all this wonderful bread was happening, I went to a very nice private school in the suburbs, and they had, they served lunch every day. They had a beautiful sit-down lunch, and we had things like shepherd's pie and, I don't know, chipped beef or whatever. And, but with every meal, they would serve a stack of Wonder Bread. And so there I had it, the 2 sides. So which one was going to win? All right, so now we have to go fast forward, let's say 40 years. All right, and life happened. At one point in 1980, I moved up here, and I got a degree in mathematics, and I got married, and I had children. 2 of them are here. They came to support me. And I had a very nice career in project management. I was working for investment companies for the last 10 years of it. And then, does anybody remember what happened in 2008? No? Yes? Do people remember? Big crash. So suddenly, after just working like a dog for years and years and years, no job. So no job, not only no job, but no jobs to be had. So I didn't feel like, my husband was still working, he had a job as an engineer, so we were doing fine, and I didn't feel like scurrying about trying to see whether I could get in this really terrible market, so I didn't. I just kind of hung out, and I did new things, and I tried new things, and I got involved in volunteer activities, which I had never done before in my life, and just this, that, and the other. And I was having a grand old time. But people can't really change who they are at some level. So there was something that needed to be happening other than kind of hanging out and relaxing, which was just too weird for me. So a few things happened that sort of triggered a new direction. One was that my husband, who, as is his way, likes to have the best equipment for whatever he happens to be doing at any given moment, had bought this beautiful Dutch oven because he was making us all an Indian dinner. And that was the proper piece of equipment for that. So he made this elaborate Indian dinner that took hours to make, and he was roasting the spices and this and that and the other. And then he stuck the Dutch oven on top of the refrigerator and he left it there. And it was never ever going to be used again. So that was irritating me. And then the second thing that happened is My sister, who is a very, very excellent cook, knew that over the years, here and there, I tried to make bread. Very, very unsuccessfully. So, I had been talking to her about this, and this didn't work, and that didn't work, and it wasn't really a very intense thing. It's just every now and then I would try to make bread, and it was just too hard. I couldn't do it. So she had read this article in the New York Times by Mark Bittman about the no-knead bread, which was, I'm sorry, I'm going to forget, Sullivan Bakery in New York. The chef at Sullivan Bakery, and so she sent me the article, and I was like, okay. So you mix up some flour and some water and some yeast and some salt, the essential 4 ingredients, and you throw it into this Dutch oven, and you leave it overnight, and in the morning you put it in the oven, and you bake it, and oh my God, you get bread. And I thought this was the most amazing thing. I couldn't believe it because it was, first of all, it was really, really easy. And second of all, the bread was pretty good. So it was very wet. It was just like, almost like, I won't call it a soup, but it was very, very wet for bread dough. And it worked. So suddenly I went from just making awful bread every now and then to being able to make sort of decent bread. So I was very excited about that. So the second that I was able to make a sort of decent loaf of bread, oh my God, I want to make schnitzel. I want to make the bread that I grew up with. So I thought, how hard could this be? Now we know how to make bread. I've made, 4 successful loaves of bread. Now I'll make this bread that I grew up with. So I set upon a quest to do that. And I made, I will say, one terrible loaf of bread after the other terrible loaf of bread. And this went on and on and on. I was talking to everybody I knew, trying to get advice on how to do it. And nothing anybody said helped. And then I got the bright idea. This was around 2000, I'm going to say 2009 or so. I got the bright idea to call pretzels. So I did call pretzels, and I spoke with the last generation of pretzels who were going to be baking bread. And I asked the woman, she was very nice, and I asked her, I really want to make this bread. I'm here in Boston. I'm not competing with you, that I should ever be able to compete with them. But I'm not competing with you. Can you just tell me how to make this bread? And she said, oh, it's just a light deli rye. That's all she said. So I'm like trying to figure out, how do I, what does that mean? I don't even know what that means. She said it like it was the most self-evident thing. But I really had no idea what it meant. So it occurred to me that I better actually buckle down, that if I really wanted to do this, and I really did want to do it, if I really wanted to do this, I was going to just have to learn how to make bread. So I did a number of things to move in that direction. One of them is that I bought this book. This is Bread by Jeffrey Hamelman. And this is, if ever there was a great book that was written, it is this book, because he breaks it down, he makes it into a science. You can understand it by the numbers, which was great for me because that's how I started out, with the numbers. And you can start to understand how this is done, how bread comes together. And he had pages and pages of explanations about how this actually worked, what was actually happening. And there was one bread that I think he called it pain au levain, pain au levain, that he said, this is the pinnacle. This is what you should be striving for, is this pain au levain, and it was made with a starter. And of course, I didn't have a starter, but it was made with a starter, and it was the pinnacle, apparently. And so I was trying over and over again. It was just like the rye that I tried to make over and over again. It didn't go all that well. At one point, I made a starter. This is something that just defeats any number of people. But I found a good website that had good instructions, and within a couple weeks, I had a starter. And so I started trying to make this pen in the pen. And one of the things that was constantly defeating me is that to make good bread takes time. And I was used to doing things quickly, because my whole life revolved around doing things quickly. I was a working mother, you know, I was trying to get everything done as fast as I could. So what I slowly learned over the course of a couple of years is that I had better learn to be patient. And nothing teaches you about patience better than making bread. So one of the reasons I kept failing over and over again is because I always wanted to go to the next step. Is it time? Is it time? And the answer was usually it wasn't time, but I did it anyhow because I was impatient. Bad for bread. So the other way that I started learning about this is I joined the Fresh Loaf. So the Fresh Loaf is it's a website. It's an online bread making community. And it changes constantly. The Fresh Loaf that there is today isn't the same Fresh Loaf as I was involved in say, 2011. But at the time, there were some just really, really excellent bakers on the Fresh Loaf. And the premise of this is that you would make bread and you would post about it. You would make a blog post about it. And there were certain rules on the site. So one of the rules was that you couldn't just take a picture of the bread from the outside. You had to cut it in half and you had to take a picture from the inside, because you can hide a lot of problems with bread. You can have a bread that looks beautiful, most of the bread you buy today, but it looks beautiful from the outside, and you cut in the middle and it's just garbage. So that really sort of instilled a lot of discipline. So even though it was just this freewheeling website and so forth, there were rules, there were standards, people commented, and they weren't mean about it. I mean, for the most part, some people, obviously. But for the most part, it was a very positive, productive site, and people would give you comments, and they would see that you were off on the wrong track, and they'd tell you, you know, what had gone wrong and so forth. And there was one baker in particular who was a teacher. He was a bread teacher he was in England, so sort of, I guess, the equivalent of a technical college or something. And so he took an interest in what I was doing, because I was obviously working just so hard at this, and he really spent a lot of time trying to teach me. So I consider many of the bakers that were on that site at that time my teachers. So I'm not exactly self-taught. I had help. So I spent a lot of time posting, making bread, posting about it, getting feedback on it, posting on other people's bread and so forth. And I think, you know, that method of learning turned out to be very effective. And I also thought it was like 10 years before, you would never have been able to do something like that. So it was just an opportunity that opened up for this moment in time where suddenly you could go and be in contact with all these bakers around the world and learn how to bake from them. So then I got into a period where I was just experimenting every which way. So I drove out to Western Massachusetts. There was a farmer there who was selling his wheat berries. So I drove out there and he loaded up a 50-pound bag, which I couldn't carry at the time. I can now. But he loaded up a 50-pound bag of wheat berries into my car, and I came back, and then I had to mill it. So I had bought a little mill, and then Once I had the mill, then I needed to experiment with different types of flours that you could create. So I bought all these sieves so that I could create different grades of flour and so forth. In the meantime, I built myself a little oven in the backyard. Now, I was the kind of person who had never built anything in my life. My husband did all the building, and I watched him and gave him encouragement. But I actually built this little oven. I reclaimed these cinder blocks from the bank that was on the corner down the street here. They were knocking down a bank. So there were all these cinder blocks. So I drove up my car and I asked the guys who were working there if they wouldn't mind loading up my trunk with cinder blocks, which they did. And they thought it was hilarious. They thought that was the funniest thing. Because I had a reasonably decent car at the time, and they weren't used to ladies driving up and with their nice cars and having the trunk filled with cinder blocks. And I bought some clay and built a little cob oven. So the dome here is made out of a clay. So that had to be, it comes in powder form, and that had to be mixed with water and sand, actually, to be turned into a building material. So made that and made this little plywood door. And the way this type of oven works, this is actually not very large. The way this kind of oven works is you build a wood fire inside of it. And it has no chimney or anything, it just vents through the door. So you build the fire, you build it up, you let it get very, very hot. I got a remote thermometer, and so basically the floor of the oven is granite. I put granite slabs on the bottom, and it gets up to around 800 degrees. Your home oven gets up to 500, 550, so this is a very hot oven. So once you let the fire burn down, you remove all the wood, and then you bake with the retained heat on the floor of the oven. So with that little oven in my backyard, which I'm sure my neighbors really loved because I was building all these wood fires, I made the best bread I've ever made. Because you put the bread in there and it would bake in around 10 minutes. You'd have bread, and it was just big and beautiful and wonderful. So I had a great time with my wood-fired oven for a while. I will say that it didn't last the winter. Oh well. So, and then meanwhile I got busy. So I was doing a lot of baking and a lot of experimenting. So I learned a thing or two. One is just the pinnacle, pain au levain, whatever. The sourdough is the king. But then I also learned that baguettes were the king. So you decide. I can't decide. Another thing that I learned is that really great bread doesn't take much by way of ingredients. I mean, bread is flour, water, yeast, and salt, okay? And if you see a bread that has like 15 other ingredients, run the other direction. You really want your flour, water, yeast, and salt. Because what I find is if you can master bread with those 4 ingredients, okay, let's throw in some sourdough as well, some starter as well, then you'll have great bread. But what people do instead of that is they say, well, this bread isn't that great. I'll make it great. I'll throw in some nuts and some cranberries and some this and some that and the other. And you basically lose the opportunity to make good bread. So it's not what I started out thinking, but it's what I ended up thinking. So try to keep it simple, try to keep it focus on the quality of the ingredients and the techniques that you're using. So a lot of people come up to me and they would, I don't know, nobody's done this lately, but I used to go to farmers markets and sell the bread, and people would say, what's your secret? What's your secret? Do you have a secret ingredient? So forth. And I was always mildly offended by that, because it's not about that. It's about knowing what you're doing. It's about doing it well. It's about doing it rigorously. It's about being patient and waiting. It's about all kinds of things. It's not about secrets. So, or the absolute best ingredient. Forget it. It's not there. It's not where great bread comes from. All right. So this was getting out of hand. I was baking a huge amount. I was experimenting like crazy. I was doing all sorts of nutty things like filling my car with cinder blocks. And I was making too much bread. It was really that simple. I was making too much bread, and I would give it away. The family would eat it, but there was only so much bread the family could eat. And furthermore, I was totally, interested in all these different rye breads, and my husband didn't even like rye. So, so I would make it, and it would sit there, and then I would be angry. So, why aren't you eating this? Don't you understand how good this is? And the answer was no, we didn't understand how good it was. So something had to give. There's always a business idea in there somewhere. You sit there and you think to yourself, I want to buy this thing. I want to buy this good bread, and it's not there. I can't buy it. So that's the business idea. It's like, okay, there's this thing I would like to buy, and I can't buy it, so I will make it. I will sell it. And then the other thing is, I thought, I'm spending all my time making bread. Why don't I start a business? It won't be very different. It'll just be sort of a continuation of what I'm doing. That's not true. That wasn't even close to true. That was so far from true. But I just have to say, this picture here is an actual bread explosion. This was, I went looking, I just typed in the term bread explosion into Google. And this was a factory in Romania, a bread factory in Romania that blew up. So there you have it. There is such a thing as a bread explosion. All right, so that's sort of the bottom-up idea. The top-down idea, there are a few of them. First of all, you should have good local bread, and it should actually taste good. For some reason, there's this idea that, okay, we'll just make bread and it won't be that good, but maybe nobody will notice or nobody will care or whatever. So here's the thing. My first wholesale customer was Apex Wine and Spirits, which is no longer with us. It was right in the same parking lot as Stop and Shop. And I was walking in there one day and delivering bread. And this woman who came in to shop, or actually I think she came in to buy the bread, but she stopped me and she said, I've traveled all over the world, and every place that I've gone, people can roll out of bed in the morning and go and buy wonderful bread for their breakfast. Except here. This is the only place you can't do that. So that doesn't make any sense. Why not? Why don't we get good things? So there you have it. So I started very small. I started with farmers markets, and I called the Lexington Farmers Market, and they said, are you kidding? We figured out our roster, 7 months ago, and we've had the same bread vendor for 7 years, and there's no way you're getting in. Besides which, who are you anyhow? So I made various phone calls, and then I called this woman in Carlisle who's running a little market, and she said, sure, why don't you show up? So it's like, oh, okay. So I showed up at the Carlisle Farmers Market. Now, I knew nothing about Carlisle. I've lived in this area since 1980, but I knew nothing about Carlisle. So what the Carlisle market was like was you would sit there and there'd be nobody there. And it would, like, that would go on for an hour or something, and you'd say, I might as well go home because there's nobody here. And then somebody would come in and buy the lot. They'd just buy everything on the table. So it was weird like that, but it was strangely encouraging because somebody would come in and buy all the bread. So that was very interesting. And if you look at this picture here, this is a card table. So that's what I started out with. I started out with a card table and a few loaves of bread, a few rolls or something. So at the next market that I went to, my husband came to see how I was doing. He looked over the whole situation and looked around and walked around the whole market, and he said, "You're too small. You have to be bigger because nobody will even notice you. Nobody even sees that you're here." So good advice. So after that, I was bigger. All right, so the business evolved. This picture is our current bakery. It's just a rack full of baguettes and some sourdoughs on the top. And behind, if you kind of look, you can see there's mixers and various other things. So I started in my kitchen, and I had a few wholesale customers, and then I started doing markets, and then I got the Waltham Farmers Market, which is a big market, and I had no idea how I was going to do it. And I did the first couple ones, and I thought I was going to die because it was just so much more bread than I was used to making. So I had a friend, we were walking our dogs together, and I was complaining to her about how I had this market, and it was too much bread for me to make, and she said, "I'll help you." So she became my business partner, and we've been partners ever since. And once she got in, she was like pushing in this, she wanted to grow here, I wanted to grow there, so we were growing everywhere. So that was interesting. Now, we were baking in my kitchen, we were using the refrigerator in my kitchen, and eventually there was no room for food. So basically, I had no room in my kitchen for food. So because it was all taken over by the business and the bread and so forth, we would put dough in the refrigerator overnight, and there was really no room for anything else. So we had to figure out something. So we ended up renting a very small place it seemed huge at the time, but a small place in Waltham. And we built a kitchen. It was very fraught, but we did it. And then then we were able to grow the wholesale business, and that grew, by leaps and bounds. And before we knew it, which wasn't that long, we had outgrown our kitchen in Waltham. So then we started running around trying to figure out what we were going to do next. We didn't even have a lease anymore because our landlord wouldn't renew our lease. And so we're sitting there, our whole business depends on being in this kitchen, and we don't even have a lease, and he could have thrown us out at any minute. But so we're running around trying to find a new place, and at one point, and we spent a year on this, it took us forever to find some place, and at one point we decided, okay, we're both from Lexington, we like Lexington, Lexington's a nice town, Lexington has the kind of people who will buy our bread, we're moving to Lexington. So then we just stopped looking all over the place, and we just waited until we found a nice place in Lexington. So we built a kitchen, this time with a store in Lexington, last year, a year ago. Okay, so back to this being wrong about it would be just like my hobby. It's different. So you start out, you love bread, and then all of a sudden you've got big, heavy equipment. We've got these big ovens. Right now we have six decks for the ovens. It's like an entire wall. hiring, we're firing, we're dealing with the regulators, many of them, because we're regulated by all sorts of different agencies, hiring contractors to build out and so forth. So the reason I included this picture of the guy with the with the magnifying glass is when I got my first wholesale license, and it's still in my kitchen. Massachusetts is one of the few states that allows you to get a license out of your wholesale license out of your kitchen. So the inspector from the state came to look things over and decide whether he would give me a license. And he came in, he was very nice, he sat down, he talked to me, and then he said, okay, let's get to work. And he pulled out a big high-power flashlight, got on his hands and knees, and started crawling around in my kitchen. So that was unexpected. And then when he was done, he sat down at my dining room table and he started writing out his report, and he came up with 17 things that I needed to change. So I was like, whoa. And it was things like, you can't have any of your bakery food you can't have any of your personal food on top of your bakery food. So I had to completely reorganize everything everywhere. And you have to have everything has to be off the floor, which I should have known, but I didn't then. And so, you know, how was I going to get all this flour off of the floor? So the one who builds, my husband, very, very quickly put together this platform that filled an entire closet, and that became where the flour was, and so forth. So it was very dislocating. And at one point he said, you have to have different containers and this and that and the other. And it was so much, I just didn't even think I could do it. So I called him and I said, really, do I really have to do all that? And he was very surprised that I had called him, because apparently you don't call inspectors and ask them to change their directives. But he talked to me and he listened to me and he said, okay, you don't have to do that. So like the thing that I was like really the most worried about how I was going to do it, he rescinded. So doesn't hurt to ask, I guess. And then he came back a year later, and I don't know if you know this word, he was verklempt. He was so happy because like all these 17 recommendations or orders or whatever they were that he had made, we had done all of them except for the one that he rescinded. And so when he came back again, he looked around and he's like, oh my God, you actually did it. And I think he thought he was going to put me out of business. But I think he thought I didn't know what I was doing, which I really didn't. But he thought I didn't know what I was doing and that I was gonna just forget about it. But I didn't forget about it, and I was there a year later, and he was the same inspector came by. So that was all very, let's call that a learning experience. So when I was doing my baking as a hobby, I would just try, every week was a different bread and so forth. And what I realized as I was putting this business together is people expect the same breads. You can't just keep changing your breads around. I mean, they may like some variety, but they still expect you to be making the thing you made last week. So you can't just endlessly experiment and try a million things a million times. So I had to kind of nail things down and get more consistent. And the other thing people really care about is having their bread on time. So like when you sell to wholesale customers, and you can sell the greatest bread in the world, but if it's not there when their customers get there, they don't buy from you anymore. So there's different values, there's different things that are important when you're in business versus when you have a really fun hobby. So I just wanted to have a few pictures of our bakery. So I love this picture at the top because this is early in the morning, and you can see 4 bakers running around in various stages of making baguettes. So it's very, very much a team sport. everybody has to know where everybody else is. We have all these protocols so that people know what to expect. When a timer goes off, who's the person who's supposed to go and run and load the oven? Everything is very choreographed. And I am not always or ever the choreographer. Somehow that all sort of wells up from below, and then people like just figure out how we're going to do things and so forth. So here on the bottom photograph is one of our delivery people. So they don't come in, the bakers consider this to be very late, but the delivery people come in at around 7 o'clock because they have to have bread to deliver. I mean, they can't come in before the bread is made. So they come in and they pack up the bread and off they go on the road to various wholesale customers. And then at the same time, we're putting bread out for our store. So what about the bread? I'm going to say around half of the bread I developed back when I was experimenting long before I opened the business. This sunflower bread, I had a meetup with the Fresh Loaf. That was that website that I was telling you about. Here, we had it right here in this room. And so people who lived in the near area came here and we all brought bread and we shared each other's bread and we met each other in person and so forth. And it was great. There was one guy who came and he was living in Connecticut, I think, and he was a Japanese sculptor. He came with his daughter who spoke English and he didn't. So he came with the most magnificent pumpkin seed bread. It was absolutely the most delicious bread that day. And I was desperate to find out from him, how did he make this bread and so forth, but he didn't speak English. And so I was asking him and he was kind of trying to talk to me. And he's sort of artistic. So he didn't do things like I do. I do everything by the numbers. He did things some other way. So we couldn't even really communicate very effectively with each other. So after that, since I got so little information from him, I just had to try to do it. So I finally came up with this bread that we call multigrain sunflower. And that was my attempt. I'm not saying I succeeded because I can't taste them side by side, so I don't really know. And his was pumpkin seeds, mine was sunflower. But anyhow, this was my attempt to recreate this wonderful bread from this baker. But we keep going. I mean, it's not like we're making a new bread every day, but we keep going. We try new things. My partner has become the pastry chef, so she's been cranking out new pastries here and there. And recently we started selling challah again, which we hadn't made for years, but we decided to go back to it. And there should be one more slide here. Oh, there we go. Okay, so most important of all, I brought some bread. We can try it. And questions?
Yeah. You mentioned that everywhere in the world you can get bread easily. And I think what you've left out of your presentation is how you price it. So I've spent time in France, and I know that the government subsidizes their bread.
That's right.
We don't have a government that subsidizes our bread.
No,
so how did you fix your pricing? How did you think about pricing? How do you think about it now?
Well, it's funny because when I started, I was just, going from a hobby to a business, and I was very, very worried that I would lose money, that this just wouldn't. So I came up with the highest number I could think of, and that's how I priced the bread.
What was that?
it's the same as it is now, because I never raised the prices. I came up with such a high number that, after all this inflation and so forth, I've, basically been able to leave the bread pricing the same. But that was just a mistake on my part. I didn't know what I was doing. I just thought, God, I better price this enough so I don't go out of business. But I didn't really know. There was no science in that. So.
I love your baguette.
Oh, thank you.
It's the best around.
Okay, well, I appreciate it.
And I wanted to ask you about the relationship between mathematics and baking, because I noticed that you and Joanne Chang of Flour both were Harvard mathematics graduates.
Yeah, I didn't know she was. I didn't realize that. I don't know that there is, but the way that I learned bread, if you're going to say that Hamilman taught me how to make bread, he does everything by the numbers, so that you can sit there and you can calculate if you have X amount of flour, how much water you're going to put in.
The mic is like sliding down forward. Just turn it off.
Yeah, okay. Thanks. So a lot of people don't bake bread that way, but no.
Let's turn this one on.
Okay. All right. That better? Okay. So a lot of people don't make bread that way. They don't make it by the numbers, and that's just a very minor amount of math in that. But I think the fact that it can be organized that way may be attractive to people who sort of have a mathematical bent. That's all.
Any other questions?
Yes, I have a question.
Oh, thank you.
A couple of things. I'm curious as to why the Japanese sculptor who did not speak English would bring bread to your store. Why did
It
he?
wasn't my store. We had a meetup.
Oh, sorry. Okay.
Yeah, we had a meetup at the library. This was long before I started business.
Okay, sorry.
Yeah.
Secondly, you said the guy, the retired baker from King Arthur's Flour.
Yeah.
Last name is Hamilman.
Yeah.
That sounded familiar. But there's a woman who works there still, King Arthur's Flour. Her last name is Hamill. So I thought I just looked it up, so it's Hamill, not Hamilman.
Yeah.
I thought that she's his wife. She's a woman, but anyway. So.
Yeah, no. Yeah, he was crotchety. I took one class there, and oh my God. But he was a great teacher. So.
Okay, thank you.
Ready for samples? I didn't. Oh, I'm sorry.
Will you just tell us what the walk-in hours are of your retail store?
Yes, I will. It's Tuesday through Friday, 8 to 1, and Saturday, 8 to 12, and close Sunday and Monday.
If there are
Any more questions?
I just have to tell you, an organized person would think that I should have cut up all the bread in advance so then we can just go eat it. But a person who loves bread would never do that. Okay?
Well, thank you so much, Varda. We look forward to trying your bread. Thank you for such a wonderful presentation.